1. Two objections. I must now discuss two objections to the general account of equality we have been constructing. In Chapter 1, we distinguished two ways in which we might compare different people's situations. We might compare the resources each has available with which to lead his life, or we might compare the welfare or well-being that each has achieved with whatever resources he does have available. I used that distinction to distinguish, in turn, two very different political goals, each of which might be thought an egalitarian goal. A political community might aim that its members be equal in their resources or in their welfare. That description of the two aims is very abstract, however, and many different ideals fit under each of these two general aims. Equality of welfare or well-being is subject to different interpretations. People disagree about what genuine well-being really is. Some people think that they achieve it when their lives are full of excitement, for example, and others think that well-being is more a matter of lasting achievement than of transitory absorption. Equality of welfare does not become a concrete political goal until some particular understanding or conception of welfare is specified. I argued in Chapter 1 that equality of welfare has gained whatever appeal it has precisely by remaining abstract and therefore ambiguous. The ideal loses its appeal whenever a particular conception of welfare is specified, which presumably explains why those who defend it rarely attempt any such specification. Equality of resources also needs further specification. A person's resources might be understood to include his wealth alone, or his wealth together with his personal qualities of strength, talent, character, and ambition, or both of these together with his legal and other opportunities. In Chapter 2 and subsequent chapters, I defined equality of resources as embracing, in different ways, all of these categories of resource, and I tried to describe a metric of equality through the hypothetical auctions, insurance markets, and legal structures described in Chapter 2 and 3 that would unite them in an overall account of equal resources. I made a further crucial distinction within the broad category of personal qualities, however, between a person's personality, understood in a broad sense to include his character, convictions, preferences, motives, tastes, and ambitions, on the one hand, and his personal resources of health, strength, and talent on the other. I said that a political community should aim to erase or mitigate differences between people in their personal resources, should aim to improve the position of people who are physically handicapped or otherwise unable to earn a satisfactory income, for example. Bonjour. But should not aim to mitigate or compensate for differences in personality, for differences traceable to the fact that some people's tastes and ambitions are expensive and other people's cheap, for instance. The objections I discuss in this chapter insist that equality of welfare and of resources do not exhaust the pertinent possibilities, and that a third ideal, equality of opportunity or capability of some sort, is preferable to both. In fact, as we shall see, these supposed alternatives are not genuine. One group of critics, I shall use G.A. Cohen's version as representative, proposes that citizens should be equal, not in the welfare they achieve, but in the opportunity that each has to achieve welfare. As we shall see, that supposedly different ideal turns out to be equality of welfare under another name. Another prominent critic, Amartya Sen, proposes the different ideal that citizens should be equal, not in their resources, but in their capability for different functionings, in their capacity, that is, to act or achieve in specified ways. Sen's statement of this ideal is ambiguous, however. If the apparent ambiguity is resolved in one of two possible ways, his equality of capabilities also collapses into equality of welfare. If it is resolved in the other way, then equality of capabilities is identical with equality of resources. The failure of these two objections to establish genuine alternatives to the two conceptions of equality I began by describing suggests that the distinction between those two conceptions is a particularly deep one. I shall argue that it signals a polar division between two visions of the role political philosophy should play in a democracy. 2. Chance and choice. Our judgments about personal and collective responsibility are dominated by a key distinction between chance and choice, a distinction that I also explore in the context of genetic discovery and manipulation in Chapter 13. We distinguish for 1,000 reasons between what part of our fate is open to assignments of responsibility, because it is the upshot of someone's choice, and what part is ineligible for any such assignment because it is the work not of people but of nature or brute luck. The whole network of our moral and ethical convictions shifts when technology or discovery makes any dramatic change in the boundary between the two. There was a seismic change when people began to attribute natural disasters to chance rather than to the choices of supernatural gods or demons whom they might have provoked. We will suffer another seismic change in the opposite direction if biotechnology one day allows parents to determine in detail the physical and mental properties of their children. The choice-chance distinction figures in assignments of a variety of kinds of responsibility. It figures in causal responsibility. My choices are among the causes of my acts, but not among the causes of my genetic predisposition to particular diseases. In this book, we have been concerned mainly with the different idea of consequential responsibility. When and how far is it right that individuals bear the disadvantages or misfortunes of their own situations themselves? And when is it right, on the contrary, that others, the other members of the community in which they live, for example, relieve them from or mitigate the consequences of these disadvantages? I used the choice-chance distinction in replying to these questions. In principle, I said, individuals should be relieved of consequential responsibility for those unfortunate features of their situation that are brute bad luck, but not from those that should be seen as flowing from their own choices. If someone has been born blind or without talents others have, that is his bad luck, and, so far as this can be managed, a just society would compensate him for that bad luck. But if he has fewer resources than other people now because he spent more on luxuries earlier, or because he chose not to work, or to work at less remunerative jobs than others chose, then his situation is the result of choice, not luck, and he is not entitled to any compensation that would make up his present shortfall. Cohen and others challenge that way of drawing the line between choice and luck. They point out that even when someone's unfortunate situation is the result of his deliberate choice, that choice might have been dictated by features of his person or personality that he did not choose. Suppose someone cannot stand the taste of ordinary water from the tap, it tastes unbearably sour to him, and he therefore chooses to buy more expensive bottled water. It is true that he has a choice whether or not to do that, but he did not choose to have the property, a special sensory reaction, that made the choice not to do so distasteful. That physiological condition is his bad luck, and he should therefore be compensated for his misfortune. He should be given extra resource so that he will not be worse off buying bottled water than others are who make do with tap water. Now, suppose someone yearns to be a photographer, but finds that if he is to realize his dream, he must spend the greater part of his income buying expensive cameras and lenses. Once again, he could choose not to buy the equipment. But that choice would make him miserable, at least for a time, and once again he did not choose to have the ambition that has that consequence. Surely, the critics would be to make someone handicapped in some other way, born blind or without talent or unable to stand tap water, bear the financial consequences of that condition. It is important to notice that this argument does not appeal to any general form of metaphysical or psychological determinism. It does not deny that people are free to choose. It does not deny that the would-be photographer is free not to buy expensive equipment, for example, but only insists that he should not be forced into a worse financial position if he does decide to buy it. In fact, the critics really rely heavily on the assumption that people are free to choose because they insist that people should take consequential responsibility for their expensive tastes when they have deliberately cultivated those tastes. Cohen puts the point this way. To the extent that people are indeed responsible for their tastes, the relevant welfare deficits do not command the attention of justice. Bonjour. We should therefore compensate only for those welfare deficits which are not in some way traceable to the individual's choices. That is why, he declares, society should compensate the photographer whose taste for photography, as he stipulates, arose from no choice, but not Louis, a character with champagne tastes whom I discussed in chapter 2, and who, in Cohen's summary, did not just get stuck with his taste, he schooled himself into it. So G.A. Cohen on the currency of egalitarian justice. Cohen agrees, for that reason, that equality of welfare is an improper political ideal. It fails to distinguish between expensive tastes that people are simply landed with and expensive tastes that they have deliberately cultivated. So he and other critics who make similar arguments reject both equality of welfare and equality of resources in favor of a supposedly third ideal, equality in people's capacity or capability or opportunity to secure welfare or some other form of advantage. Since Louis had as much opportunity for welfare as anyone else before he cultivated his expensive tastes, it is not necessary to reward or compensate him for having done so. But the photographer did not choose his burning ambition, it simply stole up upon him. He did not have an equal opportunity for welfare, and he deserves compensation for that reason. This last distinction, which Cohen claims to be fundamental, is illusory. Louis did not cultivate his grand taste to get more welfare in the way of buzzes of pleasure or ticks of desire satisfaction. That would have been irrational because even in a community committed to equality of welfare, he would have less buzz or fewer ticks in consequence. See Chapter 2. He cultivated refined tastes because, given his royal Bourbon heritage, he thought such tastes appropriate to him. He had, we might say, a taste for refined tastes. But that background taste, out of which he acted, is no more traceable to choice than the photographer's taste for photography. Nor does that fact turn on Louis' royal pedigree or upbringing. I might have called him J rather than Louis. It would not help if Cohen were to describe Louis' operative taste as second order, and then propose a principle that compensated for uncultivated first order but not second order expensive tastes. Cohen's cut between choice and luck is meant to be a deep one, and in whatever way he supposes that his photographer would suffer if he could not afford expensive lenses, so Louis would have suffered if he found, to his dismay, that he continued to enjoy TV dinners. Cohen introduces his principle by quoting John Rawls's comment that compensating people for expensive tastes presupposes that citizens' preferences are beyond their control as propensities or cravings which simply happen. Citizens seem to be regarded as passive carriers of desire, quoted at Cohen, Currency of Egalitarian Justice. Cohen insists that some preferences are indeed of that character because they are not deliberately chosen, and that the implication of Rawls's remark is that such preferences should attract compensation. Rawls did not mean, I believe, that citizens should take responsibility only for values that they choose. He meant that they should take responsibility for the values that, in his words, they have some part in forming, which suggests the different account I offer later in this chapter. So equality of opportunity for welfare or advantage, understood as Cohen understands it, is not after all a distinct political ideal. It collapses back into the simple equality of welfare he wants to abandon. If we are not responsible for the upshot of some of our expensive tastes, on the ground that we did not choose those tastes, then we are not responsible for any of them, and the community is obliged, according to his principle, to see that we suffer no comparative financial disadvantage in virtue of any of them. Cohen's argument is actually an argument for simple equality of welfare, and that argument depends on drawing the chance-choice distinction differently from the way I do. My distinction tracks ordinary people's ethical experience. Ordinary people, in their ordinary lives, take consequential responsibility for their own personalities. We know that when we make the decisions, grand and small, that will shape our lives, we must often struggle against or accommodate or submerge or otherwise come to terms with our inclinations, dispositions, habits, and raw desires, and that we must do this in the service of our judgments and convictions of various kinds, including moral convictions about what is fair to others, and ethical judgments about what kind of life would be appropriate or successful for us. We do not think that we have chosen these various judgments and convictions from a menu of equally eligible alternatives, the way we might choose a shirt from a drawer or dishes from a menu. True, it is up to us what to read or listen to, or whether to study or ponder, and for how long and in what circumstances. But it is not up to us what, having done what we have done in that way, we conclude. We nevertheless do not count the fact that we have reached some particular moral or ethical conclusion as a matter of good or bad luck. That would be to treat ourselves as dissociated from our personalities rather than identified with them, to treat ourselves as victims bombarded by random mental radiation. We think of ourselves differently, as moral and ethical agents who have struggled our way to the convictions we now find inescapable. It would strike us as bizarre for someone to say that he should be pitied or compensated by his fellow citizens because he had the bad luck to have decided that he should help his friends in need, or that Mozart is more intriguing than hip-hop, or that a life well lived includes foreign travel. Philosophers who are drawn to the language of 18th century psychology and 20th century economics refer to the great variety of human motives, simple and complex, crude and sophisticated, as desires or preferences. Those terms suggest a sharp split between those motives on the one hand and raison, judgment, and conviction on the other. In fact, most of the motives that people cite in explanation of behavior are not the raw emotions that judgment confronts, but the consequence of that confrontation. See T.M. Scanlon, What We Owe to Each Other. Chapter 1. See also Rowan Quinn, Putting Rationality in Its Place, in Morality and Action. Scanlon makes a useful distinction between what he calls attributive responsibility and substantive responsibility. The former is susceptibility to blame for some action, and the latter is what I have called consequential responsibility, that is, the propriety of someone's being in a better or worse position in virtue of that action. Scanlon believes that these two forms of responsibility sometimes come apart. He gives two examples: a willing cocaine addict who does not regret his addiction but could not conquer it even if he did, and a young man who has no taste for work because he grew up in a culture in which work was regarded as pointless and demeaning. We might well disapprove morally of both individuals, he says, because their craving or disposition is judgmental and not a true handicap, and yet not ask them to bear the financial and other consequences of their acts, because, in the case of the addict, he is not now free to behave differently, and in the case of the work-shy man, because his situation is the consequence of injustice. People's large-scale hopes for their lives, their ambitions, are plainly suffused with judgment. Someone who hopes to change the face of architecture, or to become president, or to help house more of the homeless, does not just desire but values that achievement. He would no doubt glow with satisfaction if his dreams were realized, but it is the importance of the achievement, not the prospect of a glow, that sustains his efforts, and the glow is explained by the achievement's importance to him, not the other way around. Even most of what we might more naturally call tastes are soaked in judgment. Some are not, some really are just bad luck. The unfortunate man whose tap water tastes sour would prefer not to have that disability. His condition is a handicap, and equality of resources would regard it as such. But more complex tastes are interwoven with judgments of endorsement and approval. A passionate photographer, it is true, savours the technology and skill of his craft and the exhilaration of capturing light forever, and he might cite these sensations in explanation of his passion. But he savours these in some measure, often in large measure, because they fit so well with other, more general opinions he has about the value of aesthetic judgment and response, technical mastery, visual insight, and a large variety of other pertinent values, and these more general opinions are in turn drawn from and play into a yet more general picture of the kind of life that is right, if not for everyone, at least for him. None of this need be, or often is, a matter of self-conscious assessment. But a network of interlocking and mutually reinforcing tastes, beliefs, and judgments is nevertheless at work in the photographer's psyche, and that network explains the revulsion he would feel if he were offered a pill that would drain away his interest in his art. It would seem just as bizarre for him to call his commitment bad luck as it would be for someone else to describe his loyalty to his friends that way. 3. Addicts and us. It is hard to conceive how creatures otherwise like us would behave if they did treat their beliefs, convictions, tastes, judgments, and ambitions as lucky or unlucky accidents. But we should try to imagine such creatures in hopes of better understanding the presuppositions of Cohen's argument. Imagine, then, a buzz addict whose sole aim is to create for himself a series of emotional highs or buzzes. Experience teaches him, perhaps by trial and error, That he finds the buzz he craves in certain activities and events, but not in others, in driving sleek cars fast or in learning that a homeless family has been housed, for example. He describes the activities and events that he finds to cause that buzz as his preferences. He only means, by that description, that they serve that instrumental purpose, and he values his preferences only because and so far as they do serve him in that way. His preferences are no more intrinsically valuable to him than the state of the organs of his body. Indeed, he thinks of them as states of his body, and he might find a medical analogy appropriate. It is a feature of his neutral system. He might say, neural system. He might say that he gets more pain relief from certain medications than from others. Ça, c'est très intéressant ce qu'il est en train de dire. And just another feature of it that he gets more of the buzz he wants from certain activities than from others. Dans 11 pages, j'ai fini la première partie, la grande première partie du livre et les 7 premières sous-parties sur 10. Just as he has no independent preference for one form of medicine over another, apart from its impact on his pain, so he has no independent preference for one kind of experience or achievement over another, apart from its buzz-producing capacity. Il y a 2 grandes parties, et 7 parties dans la première, et 3 dans la deuxième. J'en suis à la 7e. He knows that if his psychological and physiological constitution were different, so that he had different tastes and ambitions, these might be more efficient buzz-creating vehicles, either because any single act of satisfying the taste or advancing the ambition would produce a greater buzz, or because it would produce a comparable buzz so much more cheaply than he could afford more such acts and buzzes. He would prefer to have those preferences to his own, and he counts himself unlucky that they are not his. If he were offered an effective preference-changing pill, he would leap at the chance to take it, just as someone on a particular course of pain-relieving medicine would leap at the chance for cheaper or more effective drugs. We can also imagine a similar, though different creature, the tick addict. His driving aim is not a buzz, but the satisfaction of getting whatever it is that he finds he wants. His mission is to tick off as many instances as possible of desired satisfaction, as he calls these achievements and events. He has, perhaps, a scale of achievement that awards him more tick points when the desire is, as he puts it, a stronger one. He finds that he has a variety of desires. He loves opera, for example, and is a fanatic about the conservation of great forests and beautiful old buildings. Like the buzz addict, he treats these desires as only instrumental. Since these are, as it happens, what he wants, it is their satisfaction that is important to him. But it is a matter of critical indifference to him which desires these are. They are only contingent facts about the state of his neural system, and important only for that reason. He regards his present set of desires as advantages to the degree that they are easier to satisfy than other desires he might have had, and as disadvantages to the extent that they are harder to satisfy than others he can conceive. He can imagine desperately wanting to collect matchbook covers, for example, and is sorry that he does not, because he could easily become a champion at that activity. He, too, would take a pill to change the object of his desire from opera to matchbook covers if such a pill were available, and he, too, counts himself unlucky that, in the absence of such a pill, he finds himself stuck with the more expensive desire that he has. Try as he will to want to collect matchbook covers, he finds that he does not, and therefore that collecting them would not count for him as an incident or preference satisfaction. These addicts, I am sorry to report, have played an important role in philosophy and economics, and still flourish in some of those quarters. It is therefore worth noticing that they would find Cohen's argument entirely compelling. It would indeed seem arbitrary to them to draw any important distinction in calculating people's entitlement between disabilities and handicaps on the one hand, and tastes, convictions, and ambitions on the other. According to the addicts, tastes and ambitions that are relatively expensive to satisfy or fulfill are handicaps, and it makes no sense to treat them differently from other handicaps. You and I are different from addicts because almost everything that we would count as an ambition or a preference or even a taste is suffused, as I said, with judgments of independent value. Cohen disagrees with this account. He says that not all ambitions and few tastes are informed by beliefs and attitudes. Plenty of tastes and ambitions arise without being drawn forth by any sort of dogmatic pull. Currency of egalitarian justice. This might suggest that his disagreement with me is primarily one of empirical or perhaps philosophical psychology. But it turns out that he thinks it irrelevant whether tastes and ambitions are intertwined with beliefs and commitments. He acknowledges, for example, that the desires of someone who is driven by religion to build expensive monuments are generated by convictions, but nevertheless insists that people with such desires have a call on extra resources for that reason, provided only that they do not prefer that their projects be expensive. If you love jazz, it is jazz that you love, not some sensation that you happen to realize at a jazz concert, but that you might hope to obtain in some different and perhaps less expensive way. If you want to help save a species or a building, that is what you want, not another desire satisfaction notch on your belt. Of course, you get a thrill from jazz, and you do feel a tingle when some bulldozer is turned away from its unwholesome work. But those sensations are predicated on judgments, that good jazz is wonderful, for example, and that saving certain buildings is desperately important. The interconnections among tastes, preferences, ambitions, motives, convictions, and judgments of different sorts that distinguish us from addicts make it impossible for us to treat most of what the critics call tastes as handicaps. We cannot think that we'd be better off if we gave up some ambition or no longer found satisfaction in what we now find deeply satisfying. On the contrary, it is our various tastes, convictions, and ambitions that define for us what a satisfying or gratifying life would be, and treating these as impediments to our realizing such a life would be incoherent. Resources and handicaps, including cravings and obsessions that we wish we did not have, and struggle to conquer or dispel, enable or limit us in their ability to do what we wish to do. Beliefs, convictions, ambitions, projects, and tastes of the ordinary kind, those that we do not struggle against or hope to eliminate but rather take satisfaction in, determine what it is that we wish to do. We enjoy our labor under the former, but we reason or feel or puzzle our way to the latter, and it is among the most basic of our ethical assumptions that the responsibility for such judgment is our own. Cohen is not a buzz or a tick addict, so we must speculate about his enthusiasm for an argument that would appeal only to such addicts. He and others who make parallel arguments might have one of two reasons. They might take the radical view that our conventional personal ethics are founded on a serious philosophical mistake, that we ought to try not to take responsibility for our own convictions, but should instead think and act as the addicts do. But the critics make no argument to support that bizarre suggestion, and it is hard to imagine what argument they could make. They cannot appeal to any general psychological determinism for two reasons. First, they themselves do not challenge our general freedom of choice in action, and second, the conventional distinction we all make between circumstances and personality does not assume that we have chosen our personality, and so would not be undermined by any argument, no matter how general or metaphysical, that we could not have chosen it. Moreover, any argument that could hope to undermine the foundation of our sense of personal responsibility would have itself to be a moral or ethical argument. It would have to demonstrate some unappealing consequence of that foundation, or otherwise give us some normative reason to abandon it, and it seems unlikely that any such argument would have the power to shake so fundamental a part of our ethical economy. See Warren Dworkin, Objectivity and Truth, you better believe it. The critics could not just appeal to a supposed normative principle holding that people should never be held responsible, in any sense of responsibility, for what they have not deliberately chosen. That principle would be contradicted not only by our practice of taking consequential responsibility for our convictions, but by much else in ethical and moral experience besides, including, for example, the obligations and responsibilities most people believe they have toward their political community, their parents, and their siblings. See Ronald Dworkin, Law's Empire. It is more likely that the critic's argument stands on an entirely different footing. That they assume that a political theory need not or should not track the familiar structure of our personal morality and ethics. Equality of resources does track that familiar structure. It carries it into politics intact. It proposes a politics that we can embrace as flowing from the rest of our convictions, a politics in which citizens can make and respond to claims of justice without switching to a special, made-for-politics morality. It allows us to cite as disadvantages and handicaps only what we treat in the same way in our own ethical life. The critics might prefer to see politics in a different light, as imposed from outside by external agents using an independent morality that may contradict what their subjects believe. Cohen, for example, says that although someone whose religion imposes strenuous burdens on his life would not regard his faith as a handicap or wish to lose it if he could, there is nevertheless no reason why we, who do not accept his religion, could not treat it as a handicap and compensate him for its extra costs. Cohen, Currency of Egalitarian Justice. We apparently refers to a political majority that adopts a system of redistribution whose premises would be rejected as abhorrent by those it is designed to benefit. But any such procedure seems incompatible with the basic presuppositions of partnership democracy, which insist that citizens be able to see themselves as joint authors of collective decisions. Scanlon suggests that in certain cases in which it would be proper to blame people for their decisions, their community might nevertheless have reason to relieve them from consequential responsibility for those decisions. See Scanlon, What We Owe to Each Other. He discusses someone who has grown up work-shy in an environment in which his peers discourage a taste for work. We might not be as ready to refuse such a person unemployment relief, on the ground that he is unwilling to work, as someone not from such a background. We must take care, however, to distinguish two reasons we might think we have for that special treatment. We might think, first, that since he did not choose his distaste for work, he should not be asked to conquer it. Or we might think, second, that if he and his peers developed no interest in work because unjust and inadequate education of poverty or prejudice, in short, that work was not available to them on reasonable terms, it would be unfair to force him to accept the consequences of his distaste now. We can distinguish the two cases by imagining two different stories. That Scanlon's work-shy person is an upper-class twit, raised to think that work was beneath his class, and, second, that he grew up in a desperately poor urban slum with high and endemic unemployment. The first of the two reasons just distinguished would treat both these stories alike. The second would treat them very differently. I accept the second reason and would distinguish the stories. See Chapter 2. So, I believe, does and would Scanlon, because he is clear that someone who does not want to work on fair terms deserves moral condemnation, even in the case he imagines, and that does not seem compatible with the first reason. In any case, on this explanation of their argument, the critics propose to override the personal ethics not just of a small minority, but of everyone. They propose that we should all pretend, in politics, that we are addicts, that we shall all act collectively in ways that we would find demeaning individually. There may be a reason for such collective self-degradation, but I do not know what it is. We ordinary people, moreover, could not achieve the discontinuity between our personal ethics and our political morality that the critics, on this hypothesis, advise even if we wanted to. Since our preferences and ambitions are infused with judgments of value, and since, at least for most of us, these judgments include both ethical convictions about the shape of an overall successful life and moral judgments about the reasonableness, fairness, and justice of any particular assignment of resources, we could not separate ambition and judgment in the way that any scheme of justice defined in a welfare vocabulary requires. Addicts can neatly separate their single value, buzz or tick, from any knowledge or convictions they might have about either the foreseen or the proper distribution of resources. Their preferences reflect no independent value or judgment, but are simply neurological facts about what will produce a buzz in or a tick for them, and these preferences are therefore insensitive to the distribution of resources that they either expect or approve. If they prefer champagne and architecture to beer and construction work, they know that they will have less buzz or fewer ticks than if they had the opposite preference. But which of these preferences they have will not in any way depend on what level of wealth they predict they will enjoy, let alone on any judgments about what level of wealth it is appropriate for them to have. They may, of course, have preferences on the latter score, and these may have causally affected the other preferences they have formed, but the latter will nevertheless have a neurological existence and life of their own. Since their preferences are stable in that way, they can report these preferences to a committee or computer that can use those reports to calculate which distribution of resources would make preference satisfaction overall equal, or what comes to the same thing, opportunity for preference satisfaction equal, or if utilitarianism were back in fashion, would maximize total preference satisfaction overall. I am not suggesting that this ludicrous process would actually be feasible, even in a community of addicts. But we real people cannot participate in any such exercise, even in our imagination, because almost all our preferences, including all the important ones, are soaked in judgments that make these preferences sensitive, to a vast degree, to assumptions about the wealth that we are likely to have. Whether I endorse and therefore have a particular ambition turns on my judgment about the consequences for the rest of my life of pursuing that ambition, and those consequences depend on the overall resources that I can predict, at least within an order of magnitude, will be available to me. I might, it is true, think some ambition so important that I am willing to pauperize myself just for a chance to realize it. That is what we like to think that great artists thought in their youth. But even that judgment requires some expectation of the degree of poverty I will suffer, and its consequences for other people who might be dependent on me. Since real people's expectations play into the formation of their tastes and ambitions in this way, it is not possible for them to form stable preferences in advance of distribution, and so not possible for them to tell the computer or committee what it needs to know. For many people, moreover, the connection between preference and resource has a moral dimension as well. They take justice to be at least a soft parameter of well-being, and so they must take a view not only about what resources they are likely to have available, but also about what resources they should have available, before their ambitions and preferences can be fixed in any stable way. So even if such people were themselves committed, as a matter of their own sense of justice, to welfare egalitarianism, they could not report their preferences until they knew what the calculations based on their and other people's preferences would produce, and so, like Zeno's arrow, the process could never begin its flight. 4. People and luck. Cohen has two other objections to equality of resources that do not depend, at least in his view, on any addict-like assumption that people's preferences and ambitions are matters of good or bad luck. He devotes several pages of an essay to the first of these, but I believe it rests on a misunderstanding. He says that equality of resources would not permit a community, in the name of equality, to make special provision for people who need expensive medicine to relieve pain that, while serious, does not disable them from pursuing their plans, or for people who, because they are particularly susceptible to cold, need expensive sweaters, or for people who suffer from enduring and serious, but somehow not disabling, depression or gloominess that spoils their lives, but that they are unable to shake off. Cohen's claim raises two separate questions. First, are people who suffer from these unfortunate conditions eligible in principle for compensation under the scheme described in Chapter 2? Second, if such a scheme were put into practice in the real world, would it be likely, as a practical matter, to provide compensation for those conditions? I employ the same distinction later in this chapter in considering Amartya Sen's objections to equality of resources. The answer to the first of these questions is plain enough. Almost everyone would agree that a decent life, whatever its other features, is one that is free from serious and enduring physical or mental pain or discomfort, and having a physical or mental infirmity or condition that makes pain or depression or discomfort inescapable without expensive medicine or clothing is therefore an evident and straightforward handicap. Someone with such an infirmity did not choose it. He would cure it if he could, and none of his beliefs, judgments, convictions, or commitments would argue against such a cure. A pain-producing infirmity is a canonical example of a lack of personal resources for which equality of resources would, in principle, provide compensation. The second question cannot be answered in the abstract. But if the pain that Cohen imagines were serious and, as he also imagines, medicine could relieve it, then a hypothetical insurance arrangement would almost certainly provide funds adequate to purchase that medicine. We would need to assume many more facts than Cohen provides to decide whether gloomy people or people who need heavier sweaters would have wished to secure insurance against these misfortunes at the premium that such insurance would cost. But once again, if their situation was grave, and money would help, we might well think that they would have. Cohen apparently believes that this obvious response to his claim that equality of resources would not compensate for pain appeals to well-being or welfare in a way that compromises my arguments against equality of welfare. But I believe he misunderstands the arguments I made in Chapter 1. I did not mean to bar political philosophy from considering people's well-being in any way that would be mad, but only to deny equality of welfare as a metric of justice. When we consider which features of a person's physical and mental constitution we should count as handicaps eligible for compensation, we must of course consider the consequences of these features for his well-being. Mental illness that produces serious and enduring depression is a handicap for that reason. It does not follow that we must accept that any feature of his personality that lessens his happiness, including his tastes and convictions, is a handicap. It is the main purpose of Chapter 1 and of this chapter to explain why that does not follow. In any case, provided compensation for the unfortunate people Cohen imagines does not assume that we take equality of welfare as a goal. If the community gives someone money for medicine to relieve pain, it does so not in order to make his welfare or well-being equal to anyone else's, but because his physical constitution handicaps his ability to lead the life he wishes to lead. Cohen's final objection to equality of resources is revealing in a different way. He says that even if people cannot sensibly claim that they have suffered bad luck in having the tastes and ambitions that they do, they can certainly claim that they have suffered bad luck when, in virtue of other people's competing tastes and ambitions, what they want is expensive. How much I can have of what I want does indeed depend on what others want. In some cases, I can have more of what I want if others want the same thing, because the unit cost of manufacturing it will then be lower. In other cases, people's like preferences will make what I want more expensive, in an auction room, for example. But the preferences of others, of the scarcity of certain objects of raw materials that governs how those preferences affect prices, are certainly not matters of either my choice or my judgment. They are matters, Cohen insists, of brute luck, and hence should call for compensation under even my own views. This argument, if successful, would certainly undermine my claim that expensive tastes should not entitle anyone to extra resource, but it would also, on its own, sweep away Cohen's own distinction between equality of opportunity and for welfare and plain equality of welfare. Even if we accepted his claim that some people, like Lewis, have chosen their own champagne tastes, we would also have to concede that such people have not chosen that these tastes be expensive. They can sensibly complain that it is their bad luck that, in virtue of the scarcity of soil, of the right kind and orientation, champagne is more expensive than beer. Indeed, everyone, no matter how cheap his tastes and ambitions are to satisfy, can complain that it is his bad luck that other people's tastes, or the fortunes of supply and demand, are not such that his own tastes would be cheaper still. The indiscriminate force of Cohen's new argument points to its flaw. Once again, we should begin in ethics, reflecting again on how luck, choice, and judgment shape our personal sense of responsibility. We then see the error in supposing that other people's tastes and preferences are matters of the kind of luck that can relieve us of consequential responsibility for our acts or circumstances. The mix of personal ambitions, attitudes, and preferences that I find in my community, or the overall state of the world's resources, is not in itself either fair or unfair to me. On the contrary, that mix is among the facts that fix what it is fair or unfair for me to do or to have. Allowing someone's fate to depend on other people's external preferences, including prejudice against people of his race or class, is indeed unfair, however. For an account of the difference between personal and external preferences, see Ronald Dworkin, Taking Right Seriously, Chapter 12, and Dworkin, A Matter of Principle, Chapter 7. For an account of how equality of resources treats external preferences, see Chapter 2. This is plain in politics. It would be absurd for me to claim unfairness or injustice in the fact that so few others share my taste in civic architecture or my views on foreign policy that I am on the losing side of every vote on these matters. It is also plain in morality. I cannot avoid culpability by pointing to my bad luck that the victim of my theft lacked a preference to give me what I stole that would have made theft unnecessary. Other people's needs and opinions are not resources that can be justly or unjustly distributed among us. They are, to repeat, part of what we must take into account in judging what injustice is or what justice requires. They are, in the vocabulary of Chapter 6, parameters of justice. 5. Equality and capability. Zen also rejects resource-based accounts of equality in favor of a conception written in the vocabulary of opportunity or capacity, or, Zen's own term, capability. His objection to resource-based theories is not, however, as Cohen sees, that these take us too far from equality of welfare, but that they do not take us far enough from it. Zen says that philosophers who want to measure equality in resource terms, he names John Rawls and me, aim at the right thing, which is the personal freedom of individuals. It is not unreasonable, he says, to think of their moves as taking us towards freedom, away from attention being confined exclusively to evaluating achievement. If we aim at equality in the space of resources or of primary goods, this can be seen as moving the evaluative exercise towards the assessment of freedom away from that of achievement as such. Inequality re-examined. But, according to Zen, these advances stop short of genuine equality of freedom because they ignore the crucial fact that different people have very different levels of ability actually to do what they want. They can achieve, in his vocabulary, different levels of functioning with the same material resources. But it must be recognized at the same time, he adds, that equalizing ownership of resources or holdings of primary goods need not equalize the substantive freedoms enjoyed by different persons, since there can be significant variations in the conversion of resources and primary goods into freedoms. These variations may reflect complex social issues, but they may also arise from simple physical differences. A poor person's freedom from undernourishment, he writes, would depend not only on her resources and primary goods, but also on her metabolic rates, gender, pregnancy, climatic environment, exposure to parasitic diseases, and so on. Of two persons with identical incomes and other primary goods and resources, as characterized in the Rawlsian or Dworkinian frameworks, one may be entirely free to avoid undernourishment and the other not at all free to achieve this. Zen believes that equal freedom would be more fully served by comparing not people's resources, but their capability to engage in various functionings or activities. He appreciates the obvious difficulty. Different people rank different activities differently in order of importance. Some people think that a high level of intellectual or artistic achievement is more important than physical skill, for example, while others think the opposite. This is the difficulty that I said faces any version of equality of welfare. Whatever conception of welfare is specified, any attempt to make people equal in welfare so specified would aim to make them equal in something they value very differently. Zen suggests that it might be possible to construct an objective ranking of activities, though he concedes that any such ranking must suffer from some indeterminacy. But, as I pointed out in Chapter 1, an objective ranking would be controversial, even one with a generous helping of indeterminacy, and basing distribution on such a ranking is not consistent with equal concern for all. I shall set that objection aside for now, however, to consider, first, whether Zen's criticism of resource-based theories of equality is sound, and, second, whether his equality of capabilities really does provide, as he thinks, a genuine and attractive alternative to such theories. I shall not try to defend Rawls's version of resource-based distributive justice here, because as has emerged at several points in this book, my own position is different in ways that might be thought to make his more vulnerable than mine to Zen's critique. Rawls's list of primary goods does not include, for example, physical abilities that might make two people markedly different in their capacities to achieve the same goals. It is important to remember, however, that Rawls attempts to describe principles of justice for the basic structure of a political community and expects that provision for physical disabilities would be the subject, not of that constitutional stage, but of a later legislative stage. But Zen's criticism of my own account of equality is mysteriously misjudged. I have stressed, beginning in the earliest chapters of this book, that a person's resources include personal resources such as health and physical capacity, as well as impersonal or transferable resources such as money, and that though different batteries of techniques are required to correct or mitigate inequalities in these two major domains of resource, Both must command the attention of egalitarians. The hypothetical insurance auction for illness and physical handicaps described in Chapter 2 and illustrated in Chapter 8 aim, for example, at increasing the impersonal resources of those whose personal resources are in different ways impaired. Zen does describe physical differences between people at a finer grained level than I did in illustrating personal resources. He calls attention, for instance, to the possible importance of differences in people's metabolic rates. But it is important to distinguish between two questions in considering how far his greater level of detail marks a theoretical divergence. First, what kinds of differences between people should count, in principle, as justifying measures aimed at compensating for or mitigating those differences. Second, which differences are such that a feasible, real-world scheme for improving equality would actually mitigate or compensate for them. Sense criticism is misguided at the first, theoretical level. Metabolic rates are plainly personal resources, and equality of resources therefore counts them, in principle, as matters of egalitarian concern. The second question is more difficult to answer in the abstract. Whether any practical and justified scheme for seeking equality of resources would compensate people for an inefficient metabolic rate by supplying them with extra food stamps, for example, must depend on a host of facts, including, most conspicuously, the gravity of the inefficiency. A redistributive scheme modeled on the hypothetical insurance market would compensate for any metabolic disorder that made particularly expensive or copious food necessary for survival. But it would not, I believe, fine-tune metabolic needs by awarding marginally more money for food to marginally larger people, for example, because the administrative costs of such a program would be disproportionately great. Zen does not himself propose any concrete and politically realizable scheme for instituting his conception of equality, however, and the tone of his discussion suggests that he takes his criticism to be theoretical rather than practical. Is Zen's own positive conception of equality of capabilities, really different from equality of resources? If it is it really different from equality of welfare? Consider this statement of his position in the same book. A person's achievement in this respect can be seen as the vector of his or her functionings, consisting of beings and doings. The relevant functionings can vary from such elementary things as being adequately nourished, being in good health, avoiding escapable morbidity and premature mortality, etc., to more complex achievements such as being happy, having self-respect, taking part in the life of the community, and so on. The claim is that functionings are constitutive of a person's being, and an evaluation of well-being has to take the form of an assessment of these constituent elements. Sovereign Virtue by Ronald Dworkin. The end of Chapter 7. Closely related to the notion of functionings is that of the capability to function. It represents the various combinations of functionings, beings, and doings that the person can achieve. Capability represents a person's freedom to choose from possible livings. This paragraph is most naturally read, I fear, as suggesting that people should be made as nearly equal as possible in their capacity to realize the complex achievements of happiness, self-respect, and a significant role in the life of the community. But if it is read in that way, then it advocates not something new, but only a form of equality of welfare, and a particularly chilling form at that. People vary in their capability for happiness for 1,000 reasons, including their wealth, their personality, their ambitions, their sensitivity to the suffering of others, and their attitudes toward Milton's rival muses. Molière's misanthrope lacks the capacity for happiness of Voltaire's Pangloss. People vary in their capacity for self-respect for all those and countless other reasons, including their opinions about what kinds of lives justify self-respect. Tolstoy's Ivan Ilyich had the formidable capacity for self-respect for most of his life, but none at all close to its end, for example. People's capacities for taking part in the life of the community or for attracting the high opinion or respect of other people in the community vary for most of these reasons, and for a vast additional dimension of reasons as well. No, I'm French. And you? Yes. Other people in my community also have tastes, convictions, standards, and attitudes. Their opinion of me and my various convictions, and the degree to which they wish to make common cause with me, will reflect these. Of course, it is good when people are happy, think well of themselves, and are thought well of by others. The idea that people should be equal in their capacities to achieve these desirable states of affairs, however, is barely coherent and suddenly bizarre. Why would that be good? And the idea that government should take steps to bring about that equality, can you imagine what steps those would be? Is frightening. Thanks. You're from England. You think? Do you think I have an English accent or a bizarre accent? Maybe my accent is partly French, partly American, mostly partly English because I watch too much Doctor Who and American series. Posh. I don't know what posh means. I'm gonna look in Google translation. Really? It's Doctor Who. I watch a lot of English series. Well, I watched because now I don't have the time to do that because I work a lot. I'm a philosophy student and teacher now. I forgot that. Posh. It means chic in French. Like a bourgeois.
Bourgeois.
I sound bourgeois. No, the posh accent is because of Doctor Who. And what's the name of the last Doctor? Jodie Whittaker. She speaks like that, except in the last seasons of Doctor Who, they skip every T. She doesn't say planet, but planet. There are no T. Who are the people in England, who skip the T's? Yes, really strange. Nain. Is this the inverse of a posh accent, or what is this accent? Why do they skip T's? Where was I? I almost finished. You have no idea. Okay. Like, maybe, is it an accent of younger people? Maybe. I almost finished the first grand part of Sovereign Virtue. Just 2 pages. Okay. Because it's recent. I didn't hear this. It's recent that I hear this. Why is all this not obvious? Because we know that what makes it impossible for most people to achieve happiness, self-respect, and a decent role in community life is the lack of resources, largely impersonal resources, including education, but also, in many cases, personal ones. So we are tempted to say that what we aim to achieve by redistributing resources and creating opportunities is an improvement in people's ability to secure these important goods. But there is nevertheless a danger in putting the matter that way, the danger of sliding into the fallacy of supposing that our ultimate political goal is not simply to make people equal in the resources they need to achieve happiness, self-respect, and like desiderata, which is an attractive and compelling goal, but to make them equal in their overall capacity to achieve these goals, whatever ambitions, projects, tastes, dispositions, convictions, and attitudes they might have, which is the false goal of equal welfare or well-being. Fortunately, we have excellent reason to reject this natural reading of Sen's suggestion, because it is central to his purpose, as I said, to move even further from equality of welfare than he takes Rawls and me to have done, not closer to it. So we should adopt the following very different understanding of what he means. Government should strive to ensure that any differences in the degree to which people are not equally capable of realizing happiness and the other complex achievements should be attributable to differences in their choices and personality, and the choices and personality of other people, not to differences in the personal and impersonal resources they command. If we do understand equality of capabilities in that way, it is not an alternative to equality of resources, but only that same ideal set out in a different vocabulary. Of course, people want resources in order to improve their capabilities for functionings, that is, in order to improve their power to do what they want. But on this reading of Sen's position, it is their personal and impersonal resources, not the happiness of well-being that they can achieve through their choices, that are matters of egalitarian concern. So Zen's efforts to achieve an objective ranking of functionings is not, after all, either necessary or helpful. It is enough to distribute impersonal resources equally and find devices, like the hypothetical insurance market, to mitigate differences in personal resources so far as this is possible. Then we can allow people, through their choices against that more nearly equal background, to make their own rankings of functionings important to them. Even if sense theory is only equality of resources in a different vocabulary, that vocabulary does italicize the point I just called obvious, that people want resources not simply to have them, but to do something with them. That emphasis is an advantage, however, only so long as we are careful to make the further point I just labored, that the equality we seek is in personal and impersonal resources themselves, not in people's capacities to achieve welfare or well-being with those resources. The difference in these egalitarian goals is profound. It is the difference between a nation of equals and a nation of addicts. Better than the book? It's very interesting. I think the posh accent is not because of philosophy, but because I'm French. No. Par exemple, là, je parle français. Do you think I have this posh accent when I speak French? Really. Maybe also I speak the Google Translation English, because when I don't know a word, I don't know how a word is pronounced, I listen to Google Translation and I repeat what I hear. Oh, thank you. Do you speak French? You must. Okay. You must hear I have a French accent, no? Is my French accent hearable when I speak English? For example, I don't know what prim means. Prim. Primitive. Why prim? Ah, like I was born in... Okay. Prim like I was born in England? I don't know what prim means. Guindé. Ah, okay. See, I understand. Okay. Yes, like I have as synonyms stilted, stiff, starky. I don't know if I pronounce well. Uptight, reasonable, above board, coquet, constrained, strained, compelling. Ah, it's an expression. Prim and proper. Guindé et convenable. Yes, I understood. Like, when you translate prim in French, it renders a word that is not really, like, it's not, how do you say this? It's pejorative. We can say that in English. Yes, it's quite pejorative when you translate prim in French, a bit, but not proper. Yes, so in English too. Thank you. Thank you. It rains a lot. It's supposed to be summer. Thank you. Well, see you later, maybe. Maybe if you know, in France, to be a teacher, but especially a philosophy teacher, you have to pass very hard contests. They are le CAPES and l'agrégation. L'agrégation is harder, but both are very hard in philosophy because there are not a lot of jobs offered, and you can still teach without those contests, but it's not no, but it's not stable. For example, I found a full-time job as a teacher. It's 18 hours. I found 12 hours pour la rentrée, for September. But thank you. I already passed those last year. I didn't have them. I didn't even pass. You have first. Wait. Yes, written tests and then oral tests. Both are very difficult, and I was very near to pass the written tests for the CAPES, but I didn't have it because there are very little number of places. So I start again the preparation for those contests in September, but I will also work as a philosophy teacher. And unfortunately, Doctor Who doesn't allow me to have those contests. Yes, I didn't know that. Thank you. I didn't know that when I was a little girl and a teenager. I would have liked to know. that it was so difficult to be a teacher, and especially a philosophy teacher. But I would still have chosen this job, so I don't regret anything. France. I'm from France. You two what? You two what? It's also fun, but hard. It depends on what choices you make. So if it doesn't work, maybe I'll follow your suggestion and read books for a living. They should have told you that life is tough. Okay. See you later. India. Okay. A lot of people are watching me from India. I don't know why. So if you want to see me later, subscribe.